Why are you stalking me?
Stalking you, I'm not.
Janelle Brooks learned 3 things in the 30 seconds after stepping into the path of the man in the tailored dark suit. 1. In Seoul, being a black woman made her hyper-visible to everyone but the law. 2. Being a hotel employee made her a ghost to those who lived in the light. And 3. When she finally demanded to know why he was stalking her, her carefully constructed life of anonymity had just detonated like a grenade in silk wrapping. The marble floor of the luxury hotel lobby was so polished that Janelle could see her reflection in it, a poised, dark-skinned woman in a crisp uniform that she wore like tactical armor. Months into this role, she had perfected the art of appearing simultaneously professional and powerless, a mask of discipline that signaled she was used to being overlooked. Her father, a former intelligence officer with the mind for strategy and cold logic, had taught her the most important lesson of the shadow world. Your greatest weapon is the pattern no one else sees. I'm Maya, and you've found Afro-Korean Scripts with Maya. If you're looking for stories that challenge everything you know about the elite, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stick around. This journey is only just beginning. She maintained her distance, gripping the hotel phone with the practiced restraint of a ghost, reporting suspicious movements to a security team that didn't care to listen. She watched Kang Min-ho from beneath her lashes, cataloging the silver-streaked hair and the marks of violence on his hands. To Janelle, he was a predator in a tailored dark suit, exuding a quiet authority that made her lips part in unease and her brows furrow with suspicion. Every time he appeared in the lobby, leaning forward with hands calmly folded and a controlled, almost amused expression, Janelle felt the pre-earthquake silence that followed him. She was a woman used to being overlooked, but she was far from powerless. Her suspicious observation had become an obsession. She had recorded his presence for months, convinced that his stillness was a calculated threat directed at her. She performed her role perfectly, the suspicious, defensive girl, never realizing that while she was watching the predator was calculating just how much he needed her eyes to survive. She stood in a private, dangerous bubble, isolated from the disengaged staff in the background, unaware that the man she feared was actually the most feared mafia boss in Seoul. The tension that had been simmering for months finally reached its boiling point under the clinical glow of the lobby chandeliers. Janelle felt the weight of her father's lessons pressing against her ribs, but for once, the logic of a strategist was drowned out by the primal instinct of the hunted. Kang Min-ho stood near the center of the marble expanse, his hands calmly folded and his expression wearing that same maddening hint of controlled amusement. To the disengaged staff in the background, he was merely a wealthy guest of lethal prestige, but to Janelle, he was a shadow that had refused to lengthen or leave. She didn't realize she had moved until the polished floor was echoing beneath her sensible hotel heels. She stepped directly into his private, dangerous bubble, her defensive posture rigid and her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the fabric of her dark uniform. Janelle gripped the hotel phone she had been using to call security, her knuckles white, her lips parted in a mixture of suspicion and raw unease. "Why are you stalking me?" Her voice cut through the hum of the Grand Lotus like a blade through silk, loud enough to cause the blurred figures of her coworkers to freeze mid-motion. The lobby fell into a pre-earthquake silence. Janelle's brows were furrowed, her eyes locked onto his tattooed hands with the intensity of a woman who expected a blow. She was tired of being a ghost, tired of the hypervigilance that cost her soul a little more each day. She was the daughter of an intelligence officer, and she was done pretending not to notice the predator in her periphery. Min-ho didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his slicked back hair catching the light as he focused on her with a stillness that signaled absolute dominance. Unlike the suspicion radiating from Janelle, he appeared completely unafraid, his eyes calculating and unshaken by her public accusation. "Stalking you, Janelle?" He spoke her name with a quiet authority that felt like a physical weight, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm. "I've cataloged every time you've appeared this week," she snapped, her posture dignified even as her hands shook. "I know the pattern. I see the wealth and violence you carry, and I want no part of it. Stop following me." The disengaged staff watched from a distance, terrified to intervene in a confrontation that felt like a detonation of her carefully constructed anonymity. Janelle stood her ground, a black woman in a society that preferred her to be wallpaper, accusing the man who unknowingly owns the very ground beneath her feet. She didn't realize she had just detonated a grenade in silk wrapping, and that the man staring back at her wasn't amused because she was wrong. He was amused because she was the only one in Seoul brave enough to see him. The silence in the lobby was no longer empty. It was a pressurized chamber, heavy with the realization that Janelle had just crossed an invisible line. Minho did not move to strike or shout. Instead, he made a slight, almost imperceptible gesture to the men flanking him. Before Janelle could retreat into the safety of the staff elevators, the exit was blocked by a wall of tailored wool and cold eyes. The disengaged staff members suddenly found tasks in other rooms, their professional masks slipping into expressions of sheer terror as they realized who Janelle had dared to challenge. "The manager's office," Minho said, his voice a low, resonant hum of authority that left no room for refusal. It was not a request, but a command that vibrated through the very marrow of Janelle's bones. She walked ahead of him, her back straight and her chin tilted with a dignity inherited from her father, though her hands were shoved deep into her uniform pockets to hide their trembling. Inside the office, the door clicked shut, sealing them into a private, dangerous bubble. Minho did not sit behind the desk. He leaned against it, crossing his tattooed wrists, looking every bit the man who owned half of Gangnam, the half that didn't appear on legal paperwork. "You have a very loud voice for a woman who has spent 3 months trying to be a ghost, Janelle Brooks," he began, his eyes locked onto hers with a calculating focus. "I'm not a ghost. I'm an employee who values her safety," she countered, her brows still furrowed in suspicion. "You've been in this hotel for months, conducting meetings that make people whisper in funeral tones. I see the code words, the nervous men, the way you claim space like a conqueror. If you aren't stalking me, then why are you always where I am?" Minho let out a short, dry laugh, a sound that carried a different weight, almost human beneath the ice of his reputation. "You think I'm obsessed with you because of a romantic whim. Janelle, I am Kang Minho. People in the city don't even say my name in the daylight for fear of who might be listening. I don't stalk women." He stepped closer, his stillness contrasting sharply with her visible tension. "I follow you because you are the only person in this entire building who sees what I see. You don't just process check-ins, you catalog threats. You noticed the Russians skimming numbers before my own accountant did. You saw the man with the hidden lien on the Incheon warehouse before my security chief." Janelle felt her stomach drop as her carefully constructed life of anonymity detonated. He hadn't been a predator hunting her, he had been a strategist observing a peer. She realized with a jolt of raw vulnerability that while she had been reporting him to a security team that didn't care, he had been using her hidden genius for pattern recognition as a shield. "I'm the most feared man in Seoul," he said, his expression becoming controlled and serious. "And you, a hotel receptionist who came here to hide from a broken career, are currently the most efficient intelligence officer I have. The question isn't why I'm following you, Janelle. The question is, now that you know what I am, are you going to keep pretending you don't belong in this world?" The air in the manager's office was stagnant, the heavy scent of Minho's expensive cologne mixing with the sharp metallic tang of Janelle's fear. She stood frozen as he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit, pulling out a sleek tablet. With a flick of his tattooed thumb, he turned the screen toward her. It wasn't a list of hotel guests or a manifest of textiles, but a series of time-stamped logs of her own suspicious activity reports. You reported a man in a gray coat last Tuesday for lingering near the service entrance while looking at a watch that didn't work, Minho said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. He swiped the screen to a security still of the same man, now slumped in a chair with zip ties around his wrists. He wasn't waiting for a guest. He was waiting for the moment my car pulled into the underground garage to trigger a remote explosive. You noticed his broken watch. My entire security detail noticed nothing. Janelle's breath hitched, her eyes widening as she stared at the screen. She remembered that man. She had noticed the way he checked his wrist every 30 seconds without actually looking at the time. It was a pattern of anxiety that hadn't fit the morning rush. 3 weeks ago, Minho continued, stepping closer until he was firmly inside her defensive bubble, you called the kitchen to report a discrepancy in the delivery manifest because the crate of wine was 3 pounds lighter than the label indicated. You thought you were being a perfectionist. In reality, you had just identified a crate where the vintage bottles had been replaced with pressurized canisters of sarin gas. Janelle felt the room tilt. Her habit of noticing discrepancies, a trait her father had drilled in her until it became a native tongue, hadn't just been paranoia, it had been a series of tactical interceptions. She looked at the man standing before her, the most feared boss in Seoul, and realized he wasn't just a threat she had been watching, he was a target she had been unintentionally shielding. The third time was last night, Minho said, his expression becoming controlled and clinical. You reported a cleaning crew for using the wrong solvent in the East Hall. You said the scent was too chemical, too sharp. That solvent was a volatile accelerant meant to turn the penthouse floor into an oven while I slept. He set the tablet down on the mahogany desk with a deliberate thud. You call it stalking, Janelle. I call it the only reliable intelligence I've had in 6 months. My enemies are sophisticated, but they haven't accounted for a hotel receptionist with the eyes of an operative. Janelle leaned back against the office door, her hand flying to the hotel phone still clipped to her waist, the very tool she had used to unknowingly save his life. The pre-earthquake silence she had always felt around him finally made sense. It wasn't the silence of a predator hunting her, it was the silence of a man who had been holding his breath, waiting to see if his guardian angel would catch the next shadow.
You're the daughter of a strategist, Minho observed, his gaze unshaken and calculating. You've spent your life pretending to be a ghost, but your paranoia is actually a masterpiece of pattern recognition. You aren't in danger because of me, Janelle. You're in danger because you're too good at seeing the things that are meant to stay hidden. The silence in the manager's office stretched taut as piano wire, the weight of Minho's revelation hanging in the air like the humidity before a storm. Janelle looked at the man who claimed space with such effortless violence, her mind racing to reconcile the stalker she had feared with the strategist who had been quietly auditing her reports. She was no longer just a hotel employee in a crisp uniform. She was a woman whose carefully constructed life of anonymity had just detonated. Minho stepped away from the desk, his tailored suit shifting with a lethal grace that signaled both wealth and criminal prestige. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the mahogany surface toward her. It wasn't a legal document or a hotel memo. The numbers on the page were obscene, a financial hallucination that made her yearly salary look like pocket change. I'm offering you a job, Janelle, he said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant hum of absolute authority. Not as a maid and not as a ghost. I want you to stay exactly where you are, behind that front desk, wearing that uniform, but you will be working for me. Janelle stared at the contract, her heart performing a frantic, wary rhythm. You want me to be a spy?
I want you to be a filter, Minho corrected, leaning forward with his hands folded, his eyes focused and calculating. The people who move through this lobby think they are invisible to the staff. They lie creatively, they hide their patterns, and they assume a black woman in a service uniform doesn't have the intellect to dismantle their intentions. But you see the spaces between what they say and what they mean. You see the broken watches and the light crates. He stood upright, his shadow falling long across the office floor. You will continue your routine. You will be the perfect, disciplined professional the Grand Lotus expects. But every report you once sent to a disengaged security team will now come directly to me. You will be my eyes and ears in a territory my own men are too conspicuous to guard. Janelle felt the pre-earthquake silence settle over her again. She thought of her father, the intelligence officer who had taught her that being underestimated was the ultimate weapon. She realized that Minho wasn't asking her to become a criminal. He was asking her to stop pretending her brilliance was a burden. He was offering her a chance to wield her invisibility by choice, rather than circumstance. "And if I refuse?" she asked, her voice steady despite the raw vulnerability of the moment. Minho's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or a dark kind of respect. "Then you leave. You walk out that door, you finish your shift, and you continue living in a world of shadows where you are always looking over your shoulder, wondering which predator you missed. But we both know you won't. You didn't survive being different your entire life just to fade into the wallpaper forever." He was right, and the accuracy of his observation annoyed her more than the veiled threat of the underworld he inhabited. Janelle looked at the contract once more. 6 months of this salary would erase the debts that had followed her from New York. A year would give her the power to disappear anywhere in the world and actually mean it this time. "One condition," Janelle said, her posture defensive yet dignified as she met the gaze of the most feared man in Seoul. "I report what I see. I don't help you hurt people, and I don't lie to the authorities. The moment this job makes me complicit in something that keeps me up at night, I walk." Minho's smile was sharp enough to draw blood, a genuine glint of human recognition appearing beneath the ice. "Agreed. Tomorrow morning, you start your new shift. Let them continue to underestimate the girl in the dark uniform. It will be the last mistake they ever make." The following morning, Janelle Brooks arrived at the Grand Lotus with a newfound weight in her step, though her dark-skinned face remained a masterpiece of professional indifference. She wore her crisp, dark hotel uniform like tactical armor, her hair pulled back with a precision that signaled discipline to her peers and invisibility to the guests. To the disengaged staff drifting through the lobby, she was simply Janelle, the reliable receptionist who took the early shift. They had no idea that the private, dangerous bubble she had once feared had now become her workplace. Her first assignment from Kang Min-ho was deceptively simple: observe the staff who believed they were unseen. For 3 hours, Janelle processed check-ins and handled mundane complaints, but her mind, sharpened by her father's lessons in pattern recognition, was busy cataloging the micro-expressions of everyone who crossed the marble floor. She watched the bellbobs, the concierge, and the cleaning crews, looking for the spaces between what people say and what they mean. The disengaged nature of her coworkers had always been her greatest shield, but now it was her primary lead. She noticed how the night shift security lead, a man who usually moved with the sluggishness of a career bureaucrat, suddenly straightened his posture when a specific textile supplier arrived at the service entrance. It was a micro-adjustment in his posture, a flicker of alertness that didn't fit his established rhythm. Janelle leaned over her computer, her fingers flying across the keys as if she were updating a guest folio, but her eyes were locked on the security monitor tucked beneath the desk. She noticed a second discrepancy. A junior concierge named Min Suk was handling the luggage for a group of visiting dignitaries, but he was holding his hotel-issued tablet at an angle that suggested he was filming the floor numbers rather than checking reservations. It was a subtle, predatory stillness that signaled he was collecting intelligence, not providing service. She felt the pre-earthquake silence settle in her chest, the same cold clarity she had felt when she first confronted Min-ho. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a weapon. She waited until the lobby hummed with its usual midday rhythm before she reached for the hotel phone. She didn't call the internal security line. She knew now that was a dead end. Instead, she dialed the private number Min-ho had given her, her voice a low, resonant hum of absolute authority. "The concierge, Min Siak, is your mole," she said, her eyes following the young man as he disappeared into the elevators. "He's mapping the executive floor for someone who isn't on the guest list, and your security lead at the service entrance is his backup. They think they're invisible because no one looks at the help, but they've been performing for the wrong audience." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt like a sharp intake of breath. "Detailed and decisive," Minho's voice replied, sounding almost amused beneath the ice of his reputation. "You've done more in 4 hours than my security chief managed in a month. Stay in your bubble, Janelle. Let them continue to underestimate the girl in the dark uniform. I'll handle the rest." As she hung up, Janelle smoothed the front of her dark uniform, her brows no longer furrowed with suspicion, but set with the iron resolution of a strategist. She had finally learned to wield her invisibility by choice, and as the black Mercedes pulled up to the front of the hotel, she knew the unseen bubble of the Grand Lotus was about to become a very dangerous place for anyone who thought she was just decoration. The Grand Lotus Hotel transformed that evening into a glittering fortress of wealth and hidden violence, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive desperation. Janelle Brooks stood at her post behind the marble desk, her dark hotel uniform pressed to a sharp edge, her hair pulled back so tightly it felt like a tactical seal against the chaos. In the background, the usual staff moved in a disengaged blur, but Janelle was focused on the small, discreet earpiece tucked beneath her curls. She wasn't just a receptionist tonight. She was the silent pilot of the most feared man in Seoul. Kang Min-ho entered the ballroom not with a shout, but with a claim. He moved through the sea of tuxedo-clad enemies with a quiet authority that signaled absolute dominance, his slicked-back hair and the visible tattoos on his hands marking him as a predator in a room full of jackals. He looked unshaken, his expression one of controlled amusement as he accepted a glass of whiskey, but Janelle, watching the high-definition feeds from 32 separate security cameras, saw the private, dangerous bubble tightening around him. "3 o'clock, Minho," Janelle whispered into her microphone, her voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated only for him. The man in the charcoal suit, the lopsided gait. He's not a guest. He's a cleaner from the Busan Syndicate. He's carrying a ceramic blade in his left sleeve. Do not let him get within 3 paces. Minho's eyes flickered toward the camera, a micro-adjustment in his posture that signaled he had heard her. He shifted his weight, pivoting with a lethal grace that forced the man in the charcoal suit to recalculate his path. "Copy that," Minho murmured, barely moving his lips as he engaged a rival textile mogul in a conversation that looked like business but felt like an execution. The pacing of the gala accelerated, a psychological thriller playing out in the spaces between toasts and laughter. Janelle's fingers flew across her terminal, cross-referencing guest faces against the database of criminal prestige she had built over months of suspicious observation. She was a woman used to being overlooked, yet tonight she was the only one who saw the patterns of betrayal emerging from the shadows. "The woman in the red empire waist gown," Janelle said, her brows furrowed with the intensity of her focus. "She's been circling the perimeter for 10 minutes. She just signaled the waiter near the service entrance. They're moving to cut off your exit to the elevators. You have 45 seconds before the bubble bursts." Janelle's stillness contrasted sharply with the rising tension in Janelle's voice. He looked as though he were enjoying the evening, his hands calmly folded as he accepted a glass of whiskey. But Janelle, watching the high-definition feeds from 32 separate security cameras, saw the private, dangerous bubble tightening around him. "Through the kitchen doors to your left," Janelle directed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "The security lead you identified as a mole has been neutralized, but his replacement is unvetted. Instead, take the service stairs. I've looped the camera feed for the next 60 seconds. You are a ghost, Minho. Go." With a nod that looked like a polite farewell to his companions, Minho vanished into the service corridor. Janelle held her breath, watching the red ground assassin and the waiter converge on an empty space where a mafia boss had stood seconds before. Their confusion was a masterpiece of misalignment. They had underestimated the girl in the dark uniform, never realizing she was the one pulling the strings of the man they sought to kill. When Minho's voice finally came back through the earpiece, it was filled with that maddening, amused dominance. "I'm in the penthouse. Well done, Janelle. You see things even my shadows miss." Janelle exhaled, her posture defensive yet dignified as she straightened her uniform. The unseen bubble had held, and as she watched the gala continue its disengaged dance, she knew she had finally stopped being the person who was stalked. She was the one who watched, the daughter of a strategist who had finally found her war. The shift in the Grand Lotus began like any other, but for Janelle Brooks, the air had turned clinical and sharp, the kind of stillness that precedes a localized disaster. She stood behind the marble desk, her dark hotel uniform pressed to a tactical edge, her hair pulled back so tightly it felt like a seal against the mounting pressure. In the background, the usual staff moved in their disengaged blur, but Janelle was focused on the small, discreet earpiece tucked beneath her curls. She wasn't just a receptionist tonight. She was the silent pilot of the most feared man in Seoul. The first sign was the way the hotel's atmosphere curdled. A group of men in sharp, tailored suits entered the lobby, not with the quiet authority of King Min-ho, but with the predatory stillness of those who were looking for a specific target. They didn't look at the concierge or the manager. Their eyes locked onto Janelle with a calculated intensity that signaled her anonymity had finally detonated like a grenade in silk wrapping. Word had traveled through the underworld. The Duke of Seoul had a new guardian angel, a girl in a crisp uniform who saw the spaces between what people said and what they meant. Janelle gripped the edge of the marble desk, her knuckles white, her lips parted in a mixture of suspicion and raw unease. She realized that the private, dangerous bubble she shared with Min-ho was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a target. Rival syndicates had finally identified the source of Min-ho's newfound luck. They didn't just want her gone, they wanted to dismantle the strategist who had neutralized their cleaners and assassins with nothing but a hotel phone and an earpiece. Janelle. A low, resonant hum came through her earpiece, Min-ho's voice vibrating with a rare, cold urgency. "Do not move from the desk. My shadows are already in the lobby, but you are no longer invisible. They know you're the one who dismantled the Busan shipment. They know it was you who spotted the sarin canisters." "I thought I was a ghost, Min-ho," she whispered into her microphone, her brows furrowed as she watched the men in the lobby begin to fan out, cutting off her exits to the service stairs. Her defensive posture was dignified, but her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was the daughter of an intelligence officer, and she knew exactly what happened to tactical assets once they were compromised. "You were a ghost until you became a masterpiece," Min-ho replied, his tone one of controlled amusement, masking a lethal protective instinct. "The price of your brilliance is your safety. You've cost them millions in 3 months, Janelle. They aren't here for a reservation. They're here to collect the debt." One of the men approached the desk, leaning forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a predatory stillness that Janelle recognized instantly. He placed a hand on the marble, his fingers tracing the polished surface where she had once seen only her reflection. "I'm looking for a room with a view," he said, his voice dripping with a condescension reserved for exotic pets. "One where I can see everything that happens in this hotel, just like you do." Janelle didn't flinch. She met his gaze with the unshaken, calculating focus she had learned from the most feared man in Seoul. "The view from here is quite clear," she said, her voice steady despite the raw vulnerability of the moment. "I can see exactly what you are, and I can see that you're exactly 45 seconds away from making the last mistake of your life." Min-ho's stillness in her earpiece was the only anchor she had left. "Hold your ground, Janelle. The bubble is about to burst, but you aren't the one who's going to break." The lobby, once a place of disengaged service, was now a theater of war, and as the pre-earthquake silence finally shattered, Janelle knew that the girl who had arrived looking for anonymity was gone forever. She was visible now, and she would make sure they never forgot the sight of her. The chaos in the lobby erupted with the surgical precision of a controlled demolition. As the men from the rival syndicate moved to bridge the distance to the marble desk, the disengaged figures in the background, the bellhops and the janitors who had seemed like wallpaper, suddenly transformed into a lethal perimeter of Minho's most elite shadows. Janelle Brooks did not scream. She didn't even duck. She stood with her back straight and her hands flat against the polished stone, the daughter of an intelligence officer watching the board she had helped set. "Move now, Janelle," Minho's voice came through her earpiece, no longer amused but carrying the weight of a king protecting his most valuable asset. "The bubble is about to burst, but you aren't the one who's going to break." The lobby, once a place of disengaged service, was now a theater of war, and as the pre-earthquake silence finally shattered, Janelle knew that the girl who had arrived looking for anonymity was gone forever. She was visible now, and she would make sure they never forgot the sight of her. The chaos in the lobby erupted with the surgical precision of a controlled demolition. As the men from the rival syndicate moved to bridge the distance to the marble desk, the disengaged figures in the background, the bellhops and the janitors who had seemed like wallpaper, suddenly transformed into a lethal perimeter of Minho's most elite shadows. Janelle Brooks did not scream. She didn't even duck. She stood with her back straight and her hands flat against the polished stone, the daughter of an intelligence officer watching the board she had helped set. "Move now, Janelle," Minho's voice came through her earpiece, no longer amused but carrying the weight of a king protecting his most valuable asset. "The bubble is about to burst, but you aren't the one who's going to break." The lobby, once a place of disengaged service, was now a theater of war, and as the pre-earthquake silence finally shattered, Janelle knew that the girl who had arrived looking for anonymity was gone forever. She was visible now, and she would make sure they never forgot the sight of her. In the monitors, she saw Minho move through the lobby with a lethal grace, his tailored suit a blur of dark elegance as he neutralized the man who had dared to touch her desk. He paused for a fraction of a second, glancing toward the camera with an unshaken, calculating focus. "Understood," he murmured. "Clean them up, Janelle." The pre-earthquake silence she had once feared had become her native tongue. With clinical efficiency, Janelle dismantled the rival gang's coordination, locking doors, triggering fire suppressants to blind them, and feeding Minho's team real-time data on every micro-adjustment of the enemy's movements. She was the one who saw the patterns. She was the one who turned their own sophisticated tactics against them. By the time the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, the private, dangerous bubble of the Grand Lotus had been purged. Minho entered the security hub, the tattoos on his hands slightly bruised, his expression one of controlled, genuine respect. He didn't offer her a bow or a formal thanks. He simply stood beside her chair, looking at the screens where the remnants of his enemies were being swept away. "The hotel wants to know if you're coming back to the front desk," he said, his voice carrying a maddening hint of that familiar amusement. Janelle looked at her reflection in the dark monitors, a poised, dark-skinned woman who had finally stopped pretending to be invisible. She thought of the terrible, devastating waste of the years she had spent hiding her brilliance, and then she looked at the man who had been the first to truly see her. "I think the front desk is too small a board for me now, Minho," she replied, her voice steady and dignified. She reached up and unclipped the hotel phone from her waist, laying it on the console like a discarded relic. "You said everyone who matters would know exactly who I am. I'm ready for them to see." Minho's smile was sharp, a sign of the partnership that would eventually transform the city's underworld into something more efficient, more disciplined, and far more dangerous. "Then welcome home, Janelle. The city has been waiting for a mind like yours." As they walked out of the hub together, Janelle Brooks finally stepped into the light, no longer the stalked, but the strategist, the hidden mind behind the most powerful man in Seoul, wielding her visibility like the weapon it was always meant to be. Some stories end, others follow you home. If this one did, subscribe. There's more waiting.